At the same time, this is informal. We've got a nice, small, intimate group. So at any point, I probably have more to share than I have time to share it. So at any point, if you'd like more information about something, just stop me, interrupt me, and we can chat about the things you're interested in. Later on, you will also get a link to a bit.ly that you have access to connect with me through a newsletter that I'm doing. I've just done 2 so far. I send them out about once a month. And they're sort of chronicling my journey, the things that I'm learning, the questions I have, and the places that I'm struggling. So if that's interesting to you, you can keep in touch with me that way and get plenty of more information. All right, I am very pleased that the Virginia Council of Teachers of Mathematics has invited me to meet with you all today. I am in California, in Southern California. San Diego County is where I live. I'm sitting here currently in South Orange County. So it's quite a pleasure for me to be able to connect with all of you here today. And VCTM has also asked me to share this information with you. I've been finding it personally enriching to become a member of a lot of different state math councils, and it's one of the ways I've been able to connect with a lot of folks. So they've asked me to share this screen with you as well. So if you have any interest and are not a member, you can activate all these benefits for just $30 per year. All right, let's see if I can figure out why my screens aren't advancing. All right, so thanks so much again. This is Pillars and Practices. I'll be talking about my ungrading framework that I'm using to catalyze change at the margins, and we'll talk more about those things as we go. You can see my contact information. I'm pretty active on Twitter. You're welcome to reach out to me by email as well if you would like to continue the conversation, have any questions for me, or would like to share your experiences. I am sharing with you a lot of thinking and I would say 6 to 7 weeks of doing in the larger sense. So I'm still a novice at a lot of these things. I'm learning through trial by fire. But I'm leaning into it. I've got a lot of advantage and privilege where I teach right now. We have a ton of autonomy in our school district, more so than any other place I've worked. And it seems to be like the premium benefit or advantage here. And so while we don't have tight PLCs, I am able to try these things and people are like, cool, let us know how it goes. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the First Nations people on whose land I live and am presenting from. These are the Kumeyaay people and the Luiseno people whose land was stolen from them, the unceded lands of these folks. And I'm here to acknowledge that we can honor their land and honor them, not only by being good stewards of the land that was stolen from them and colonized, but also by advocating for them, for seeking justice and hoping for restoration for them. This helps put me in a place where I reset my thinking about the larger goals of education than just the things I'm doing in my math class. So I like to begin with a land acknowledgement to help me set. Okay, so I wanted to share with you an illustration. I had the opportunity to present a similar version of this last June in Florida at the Florida Council of Teachers of Mathematics meeting. And the keynote speaker was Dr. Robert Q. Berry, he's a recent past president of NCTM. And as he always does, he gave an amazing and super inspirational keynote. I came in on day 2 as a speaker, and everybody was there for the keynote. So we got started and I was asking them, hey, how'd you love that keynote yesterday? And everybody just, let out, oh, like, well, how good. And sort of just, tongue in cheek, I was like, how about a pop quiz? But I sort of scoffed it off. But I asked the participants to take a few minutes to chat at their table spaces about their takeaways from Dr. Berry's session. And we let it go. And I'd say, after about 6 or 7 minutes, I had trouble reining people back in because they were really enjoying not just the opportunity to be back in face-to-face with other educators, but also just because the session was super impactful. So I followed this up by asking them what impacted them, but then I actually did have a pop quiz presented. And so I got their attention and told them they could write down their answers and that they were going to be able to grade their own quizzes. And you could just tell, like, the countenance in the room completely changed. I took something that had been joyful and there was just already an air of discomfort around feeling quizzed on it. And I had a set of questions prepared. And the first question was, what was the title of Dr. Berry's presentation? And already people started looking around like, is this guy serious? And no one knows me to know at that point that I'm kind of a kook. But you could tell, like, I imagine, as a person who has presented a couple of times, that I have a very limited character space for planning a title. Sometimes the title that I'm thinking about doesn't fit. So I think as a presenter, a lot of thought goes into a title to capture what it is you want to talk about, but also to fit within those restrictions. So while it may have started to prove the point, genuinely speaking, what's the title seems like a pretty relevant question. I think other questions were things like, where is Dr. Berry a professor, and what is his email address? Those facts were all on the first slide. And at this point, you could tell people were kind of catching on that I was being a little bit ridiculous, but at the same time, I was trying to model an experience that I think a lot of our students have in our math classes, or traditionally in math classes, which is the information that sort of seems relevant on the surface, and the information that's definitely easy to test or quiz on may not always be the heart of what's exciting or impassioned about the content. I did get into another question that was based off of this slide, and the question was set up something like this. On the slide titled "Teachers Are Identity Builders," Dr. Berry writes a sentence that begins this way: understanding the strengths and motivations that serve to develop students' identities should be blank. And I asked them as their quiz question to fill in what the blank was from Dr. Berry's slide. And at this point, of course, no one had any idea, and I made all these ridiculous comments like, come on, everybody, like, this was a really important slide. And Dr. Berry even underlined this in red, like all these ways to sort of highlight what I think sometimes our students' experiences were. And I didn't really know how it was going to go. It just sort of occurred to me after listening to his that I could tie in some of those things about the assessment and grading environment that students typically face that seems to sort of separate students from being in the position of learners to in the position of good grade getters. So I wanted to throw that out, and it turned out to be a really brilliant experience. I wish I could recreate it for you, but I'm just trying to recount it. All right, so another session that happened during that same first day was by Farshid Safi. He's a mathematics professor, or mathematics education professor at University of Central Florida. He was one of the folks that I knew of and was going out there to listen to. And during his talk, he mentioned the article, it's in small print there on the right. And the article features these 9 equitable mathematics teaching practices. And I would ask you, as you glance over this list, just drop something in the chat. If you see something like, yeah, these are great, just drop a +1. If this is the kind of stuff that as an educator, you're like, yes, 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 like these are definitely great practices that we should be implementing in our mathematics classrooms. So go ahead, if you will. And if you're feeling that way, like I am, kind of excited about this list of things, just drop a little acknowledgement there in the chat box. And I walked out of Dr. Safi's talk thinking, drawing on students' funds of knowledge, super important. Positioning students as capable, like, yes. Monitoring how students position each other. Who do they look to as the experts or the smart kids in the class? Attending explicitly to race and culture. I work in a school district that's, I would say, predominantly white, but we have a lot of diversity. And nevertheless, there's still this strong culture of whiteness. And you'll see in a little clip I've got later that it's not all white kids, but it has a lot of white kids, but there's a feeling of whiteness. And I would say that the students of color definitely don't necessarily get recognized for the race, culture, and ethnicity components of their identities that get brought in a lot. So like you all are saying in the chat, I felt the same way, like these practices, this is where it's at. So then I shared with the group a couple of pages from one of the exams I had written for an Algebra 2 test a few years back. And at the time I wrote this, I thought, this is the nicest test I've ever written. And I've always felt fairly confident in my test writing abilities, but I thought this one was really nice. I had been reading the Catalyzing Change series, and I was trying to find ways to spotlight what students knew and not so much focus on just the things that they didn't know. I wanted the test to have some entry points and to help them build connections and not just be purely skills oriented. Oops. And so I had this set of 3 equations. As you can see, they are similar. They're all quadratic or of quadratic type, and they have the same coefficients. So we as teachers recognize the connectedness of all of these. And so this first question is just giving them a chance to identify some characteristics, how they're alike, how they're different, et cetera, et cetera. The second question there at the bottom, part B, tells them that the solutions to A are 4 and -9. So here I am removing a barrier, even for students whose factoring and solving skills might not be super on point. And I introduce a method by a fictional student named Taryn, and I have them sort of consider Taryn's method and explain if it's correct or not. And I thought this was just like a really nicely crafted question. The next 2 parts, you've got a student, Mark, who says that to solve equation B, you have to do it this way. And so it's an alternate solution to the same problem. And then I have the students contemplating whether Mark is right or not. And then ultimately they can test their skills, but maybe building on something they've learned by looking at part D. So I thought this was a super cool test. I was happy with it. Other questions I just thought were like right on the money. But then I came back to Dr. Safi's slide and I thought, all those equitable mathematics teaching practices that I was so like taken with, right? All the emojis that you all dropped, those are the ways I'm feeling about these too. And I was thinking how few of these are reflected in this test. Maybe I'm drawing on students' funds of knowledge. I'm trying to accommodate for that. I don't know whether I'm positioning students as capable. I actually found out that students found all of this construction to be a little overwhelming and confusing. How am I getting into the ideas of how students are positioning themselves, the impacts of race and culture, talking about discourse and language? I wasn't really sure. To be honest, even though I thought it was one of the best tests I'd ever written, looking back at it through this lens, I wasn't really sure how great it was or how much of students' brilliance it was capturing. So ultimately, I was left feeling this way. This classic meme, all those equitable teaching practices are looking at the way I'm doing grading and assessment, where I'm focusing just on tests, quizzes, and homework and being like, what up? Like, did you forget about us? And this is kind of where I've been heading as I was looking towards something different, which ultimately led me towards the Pillars and Practices framework. Here's one more version of this meme. I'm calling this a hard to swallow pill, and it's this. For me, tests are flawed instruments. And I believe that's true for all of us. Our grades do not measure what we think they do or what we want them to. Maybe even in the best of circumstances, they do to a degree, but not perfectly. And we can think about all the reasons and the noise and the different things that students walk into around tests, especially coming out of this virtual year and a half where we have less control or oversight into how students are doing. I'm sure we all reflected on how well we adapted to those kind of environments. And I just thought, you know what, this is not working. I don't know that my tests are valid or reliable. I'm not really sure by looking at them that I can clearly say what a student knows and doesn't know. So I came up with this hot take, and this is a hot take directed at myself, but if it resonates with you, then you're probably in the same spot that I am. If we say we're about equity in mathematics education, but we ignore the impact and the power in how we grade, especially because we know that our grades disproportionately affect historically marginalized students, then we're not about equity in mathematics education. Just let that sink in. For all the ways we talk about equitable math teaching practices, if that doesn't translate into our assessment and evaluation components, then we are continuing to marginalize and harm the same students that have historically been marginalized. And are we really doing the equity work that is so important to us? And for me, that's sort of where it all started. So I'd like you to take a half-a-minute activity. I'm gonna have you, I'll set the timer here in a second. And for the first 20 seconds, I want you just to think about this prompt as if you met someone in a coffee shop and you started chatting, and maybe they asked you to describe yourself as a math student in school. And then in the last 10 seconds, I just want you to type in a 1-sentence synopsis of how you'd answer that question. And then when the timer hits 0, you can drop that in the chat. All right, so if you're ready to go ahead and drop that. Make that beep go away. Let's see, try this. Ah. I want to know why. Susan, if you're comfortable, would you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So for me, it's why do I do this, and what's behind this, and what's the method, and what's the concept, and it's not just do this step and this step. I'm like, well, what's the reasoning behind it?
Okay. Wanted to know.
And for me, that understanding is what's helps me make connections from one thing to the other.
I love it. I love it. And Julie wrote, I enjoyed mathematics and was good at it, but didn't have to work too hard to be good at it. And Lisa wrote, good at memorizing and enjoyed following procedures. Anne wrote, I got a lot of validation for being quick at math and it gave me confidence. And I wrote, I didn't study much or do much homework, but I was a pretty good test taker. And honestly, I skirted by without having to work too hard until I wasn't able to do that anymore. That happened somewhere in college. And if we were to ask questions like these to our students, we would see some similarity in these answers, of course, but we'd also get a lot of things that say, oh, I get B's, or things that sort of attach meaning to how we think about ourselves as math students to the performance that happens in our classes. Susan popped in and said she sucks at memorizing. And a lot of our students are feeling a lot of these same kinds of things, but so much of their identities are wrapped up in the performance that wraps up in a grade. So here's a few of the thoughts. These essentially come out of the Catalyzing Change series. In my mind, grading is identity work. How students feel about themselves as learners, but also just as students in general, and math in particular, happens a lot to do with how we're grading. Grading is agency work. Students who have done poorly in classes feel that they're not good at math, and then they quit, they give up. And grading is how we track and how we decide to open or close pathways of access. I know in the school where I'm at right now, if you have a student who drops off of an honors track, there's really no way to ever get back on it. That's literally a conversation we've been having this week with a couple of particular students in mind. Maybe you're at a school where students have opportunities to move in or out of between those tracks, but grades tend to be one of those barriers. And so as I was reflecting more on the Catalyzing Change series, which talks so much about mathematical identity, mathematical agency, and removing barriers through tracking as a goal, this is sort of what led me to thinking about ungrading. And this was not something I planned to do. I tried to resist going there. I was heading towards a different revolution of my grading practices. And the more I struggled and thought about it, I ended up in this ungrading camp. So I'll be sharing more about that as we step in as well. All right, so it was from all of these thoughts that the Pillars and Practices framework was born. And like the screen here says, it was a huge shift away from anything I had ever done. I really went into it with ideas and some philosophies, but not a lot of sense of how to pull it off. And that's the journey that I'm on right now. My inspiration and influences largely have been these folks. We have in the middle, Dr. Gholdy Muhammad, the author of Cultivating Genius. And on the left, Joe Feldman's book, Grading for Equity, which talks a ton about a lot of our common grading practices and the ways that we might think we're being fair, but there's so much bias in terms of where we cut breaks and the ways that we adjust, and looking at some of the numbers and the mathematics. And then the one on the right was Street Data by Shane Saphir and Jamila Dugan. And these books were the ones that sort of really got my wheels spinning. Gholdy Muhammad's book, Cultivating Genius, is probably like my top book of all time in terms of influencing where I've come at this current moment. I might share a little bit more with that as time permits. I definitely have more about it in some of my resources to share if you're interested. All right, so here's 3 quotes. I'll just read them quickly in case they're small on your screen, but I'd like you to reflect on one for a moment, and then in a moment I'll ask you to just sort of resonate in the chat about one of these quotes. Joe Feldman wrote, actually not in his book, but in an article that came out before his book, equity must be central to grading. Otherwise, we may fail to interrogate century-old grading practices that reward privilege, perpetuating gaps in achievement and opportunity. And it was actually his book that got me on my journey to start understanding the history of the A through F grading system that we still use in this country, where it came from, when it originated, what its original purposes were. And honestly, it was mind-blowing to know what that history was, and even more mind-blowing to know that we still use essentially the same version of it today. Mohammed's book writes, our Black students are not failing. It is the systems, instruction, and standards created to monitor, control, and measure a very narrow definition of achievement that are off the mark. And Shane Saphir writes in Street Data, for all our talk of being student-centered, we have bought into a success paradigm that robs many children of their voices, marginalizes their gifts, and prioritizes measurement and incremental improvement over learning and transformation. And honestly, I've got these books so heavily bookmarked. I guess Street Data is here, and you can just sort of see, like, I'm typically one of those people who, like, I read a passage and then I was like, what was I even reading? So I've adapted to like excessively tabbing as a way of keeping focus. But there's so much richness in these books. It was hard for me to pick a quote. If there's one thing here or one thought that comes to your mind because of it, take a moment, please, and drop it in the chat. I'd love to hear what's resonating with you, especially in your own particular teaching contexts. These books, by the way, and some others are referenced in some of my resources. So if you have interest in knowing more about some of these or how they've influenced the work that I'm doing, I have some things to share about that as well. If you don't feel like typing, but you'd like to hop on the mic, of course, you're welcome to. If there's anything here that is touching you, especially in terms of your own current teaching experience, feel free to share. Rob's children are their voices. That's been a big one on my mind as well. I've been reflecting a lot on how much I've sort of put myself in the center, even when I have thought of myself as doing student-centered things, how much I've still sort of been the middle of it. And only in recent time have I been focusing more on what aspects of their voice are being missed because I'm taking up the space. Equity in grading is not clear to me, but I have a student who perks up with hands-on activities rather than bookwork. I want to do him justice, for sure. I think of equity in grading essentially as recognizing that we have systemic issues that have contributed to what we now think of as the achievement or opportunity gaps. We live within, teach within, work within, think and understand within systems that are designed to favor certain students and not designed to recognize the brilliance of others. So for me, that idea of equity in grading has been, how can I really be sure that the students who don't think the way that I do or have the same cultural reference or identity markers that I do, how can I be sure that I'm honoring their learning process, especially when it comes to how I hand out grades? And I'll be chatting more about that for sure. All right. So here's a few things about what my classroom looks like this year. You can see I have no desks, and I'm building in a lot of the practices from Peter Liljedahl's book, Building Thinking Classrooms, which is a book that's come from over 15 years of research and over 400 classes. This book just came out last October, and it's been blowing my mind. He talks about having the students in vertical whiteboard stations. He talks about having the students randomly grouped every day and visibly so. He has them in groups of 3, more effective than a group of 4 or 2 for high school and middle school ages. He talks about there being 1 marker in the group. He talks about the teacher delivering a prompt at the beginning of class, a non-routine kind of thinking problem, verbally, or orally, and then having students go off to working in groups. And I've been trying it out, and it's been fascinating to see how it goes. I should also mention up front that part of my grading system this year of going with ungrading is I have no points. I don't even have a grade book. No points, no grade book. We'll talk more about those things as they go. So what you're seeing then in terms of my class is we have students working in whiteboard stations. Sometimes I pull out these folding tables and folding chairs. In this case, you can see students working with a compass. This is a statistics class over here on the right, and students were using a Desmos activity, but they were working together in a single one. And so we had chairs huddling around. So I've been exploring with this idea of a deskless classroom. This is what it looks like. I would say about 3 days a week. We meet every day, where I have students working in these vertical stations on problems. I give them very little direction. I don't give them specific instructions, and then I just have them go to it. And honestly, I had no idea how it was going to go, and I thought it would be a bit of a struggle, but students adapted to it really quickly. I had a few students the first week who expressed concern about not having desks, not having hard surfaces for writing. What are we going to do when we start normal school? That was one of the questions. And I've just continued to challenge what normal school looks like and how it's been helpful. And overall, most students have adapted pretty quickly. And I'd say even at this point, the students who originally were really reluctant not to have a more formal setting, if I tried to give them desks now, they don't want them. So that's been interesting. All right, so I probably picked the wrong year to change everything, to lean into every uncomfortable space with practices I have never really done before. My current status is definitely exhausted, as I'm sure all of you are as well. It's just a hard year, and it's definitely a year where it's taking a new toll on me because I don't have resources, activities, lessons designed for this kind of a classroom. So I'm spending a lot more time than normal planning them. But here are the trade-offs in my ungrading classroom. I don't grade anything. I look over student work. I collect very few papers because we use very little paper, but students work in Desmos frequently, and I look through those. I leave comments, especially if I can do that while they're working. Things that they need to finish asynchronously, I try to get to it when I can, and honestly, if I use Desmos a lot, I'm not able to provide the kind of feedback I want. But I grade nothing. I don't even have a grade book. I've tried to update a grade book so I can use it as sort of a correspondence between families and myself, but our system only takes number values and percentage calculations, and I don't want those things. So currently, I don't even have a grade book. I don't have issues with cheating. Students have remarked about the fact that it's you can't cheat in this class because there's nothing to cheat on. There's nothing that's worth points. And yet, as you saw in that little video clip, students are engaged, they're working. And I have had no parent complaints so far. So we're gonna keep it status quo. Not everything is perfect and hunky-dory. Aside from being exhausted, there are definite challenges, and I'll address some of those a little bit later. But I want you to recognize that for all of the craziness and new practices, number one, I'm getting a lot of support from students, which is translating into support from families. It's translating into tolerance from my administrators and my colleagues. I expected more pushback as well, but they're like, yeah, try it and let us know how it goes. I haven't had a single conversation with students about how many points do I need to get this grade or that grade. And once in a while, we'll talk about portfolios and different ways of demonstrating learning. And I set due dates on things, but there's no points, so I can't penalize them per se. And even yesterday, a student was like, well, I know it's due Friday, but if I don't have time to finish it till Sunday, will you take points off? And I said, what are points? Well, are you gonna drop my letter grade? And so it was a chance to sort of re-talk about that. So students are still adapting to a new system where they're accustomed to navigating how they earn points, how they make up lost points, all that kind of thing. And those are not conversations we have anymore. So I'll share more about that as we go. Okay, so before we get into the framework itself, I want to just tie up a few loose ends on my rationale that led me to it. And my number one is right here. I want to redefine student evaluation, how students' grades are reported, but also the information that leads to those grades in light of what I value. And I don't value busy work. I don't value homework in the way that it serves some students and not others. And we all know that some students will get it done for the points, but not necessarily as a learning opportunity. We also know that some students don't do it because they lack time, but need the practice. Some students don't do it because they don't need the practice. They think it's dumb. Some students don't do it because they forget. And so we have all these various policies around that, but I'm not really sure where the value is in it. What I want is the learning, and what I don't want is the fight about the points. And that leads me to my second one. The Pillars and Practices framework is helping me shift students' classroom interactions and values away from this constant struggle to earn points towards, I'm hoping, something that's more focused on learning. And one of the reasons I love this particular image is the figure on the left, which looks to be older, so I'm interpreting that as the teacher, has a really aggressive look and a strong stance. That person's gonna win this tug of war. The character on the right that looks younger to me, I interpret as the student, has a very timid look on his face. You can tell he's not confident about winning this battle. His physical stance doesn't look like he's in an advantageous position. And ultimately, this image encapsulates for me this power struggle that exists in the classroom over points. And that's what I don't want. And finally, the Pillars and Practices framework helps me rehumanize what I think is the most imbalanced aspect of the school experience, and that's how we grade. For all the ways we talk about bringing student voice and raising independent learners, I traditionally hold all of the cards and all of the authority when it comes to grades. And this little phrase on there and the rest of it, turns out that after I adjusted my grading practices, everything else, curriculum, instruction, assessment, all of those other things were impacted as well. So here's just a recap of those 3 goals. All right, so let's talk about the framework. The pillars is a reference to the 4 pillars, and the practices is a reference to a set of practices. The 4 pillars is the student-facing piece of this framework. That's the thing that I talk a lot with students about. I am working with them to build understanding around the pillars, and then ultimately for them to think, reflect, and respond in terms of those. I'll share more about that in just a moment. The practices is the teacher-facing piece of the framework. And in line with one of Dr. Goldie Mohammed's points in her book is this idea that we are in a very skills-oriented educational system. For as long as I can remember, it's been content standards, it's been standardized testing, it's been performance data, and all these things are built around how students do on content standards. And obviously that's important, but it's also so well embedded that I can play around with adjusting the place value, and that one's not going to go away. That one is secure enough. But it's that same drive for performance and content standards that I feel has driven us to be so focused on using points as a system or an economy. So I'm talking about a set of practices that align what I want in terms of student evaluation with what I value in terms of learning goals. We'll get all into the specifics in just a second, but I want to start with a few of the critical elements for me of the framework. And the framework isn't super prescriptive, so I happen to be taking it in an ungrading direction, but my original intent was to use it in a form of standards-based grading, where the standards were not the content standards, but a different set of standards. We'll talk about that in a minute. I wanted to share a quick video clip. This is Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz. She is an associate professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, and a lot of her work revolves around this idea she calls the archaeology of the self. Essentially mindset work, especially for educators like me who have grown up very traditionally. I'm a white middle-aged guy. I've had access to the privilege of living, working, thinking, and knowing myself within a system that's focused around whiteness and the dominance of white culture. But when I have students that have different identity markers, they may have let's just say, experiences that don't necessarily reflect my own. And so a lot of her work about archaeology of the self says, if we're going to understand the plight of our students and how to work best on their behalf, it has to start here. So I'm going to show you just a brief clip where she talks a little bit about the archaeology of the self. Just like 90 seconds.
About teaching has to come from what you believe about the children.
I think you can hear it, but let me know if you can.
And so if you don't do that work for yourself, how are you really going to be open to the stories and the lives of the students that you teach? When I think about my work, and specifically the work that I seek to do with those who are not yet teachers, so pre-service teachers, but I also work with in-service teachers. There's a concept that one of my doctoral students helped me to shape and define in my mind, and that's the archaeology of the self. And simply put, the archaeology of the self, like an archaeological dig, like a digging deep, like a peeling back of layers, is for the teachers to really think deeply about how these issues live in them. Issues of race, issues of class, issues of religious practices, how they look at those who practice religions other than their own, how they look at those who have sexual orientations other than their own. Because for me, I believe that in order to teach someone, in order to be open to someone, and that really is what teaching is, to be open to other people's stories, that you have to know your own story, that you have to be aware of who you are, what you bring to the classroom, how you're going to interact with the children that you are there to serve. And if you're not open with your story, if you do not think deeply about how these issues live in you, you will just exact harm.
All right, so we'll leave that there for now. There's more to that clip, and there's actually a longer version that's almost an hour where she goes into more detail. If that's something that's interesting to you, I have that in my resources as well. So critical elements. For me, this was about mindset work. If I truly want to build my practices, including my grading system, around a belief that every student is brilliant, then I have to interrogate my ideas of how I observe and perceive brilliance that doesn't necessarily match the way, the cookie cutter way that school has tended to favor it. My second critical element was I got rid of grading system that's based on tasks and events, which ultimately meant I'm getting rid of points. So this particular task isn't worth points. We have to navigate how we have accountability and responsibility for students to complete tasks. That's built into the framework of how it all goes, or the fabric of how it goes. But getting rid of those is that initial step for me that helps students realize they had to shift their thinking. I wanted to center practices that represent outcomes I value, and that wasn't getting things done. I remember last year I had a student, grace was like the big theme last year. And I had a student very late in the semester who said, oh yeah, I did all those missing Desmos assignments last night. Can you update my gradebook? And I was like, how? You have like 13 missing assignments. Yeah, I did them all last night. And my thinking was, so they're quality, right? You must have done them really well if you managed to do 13 Desmos assignments in one night. And I wanted there to be something where the value isn't in finishing it or getting it done. And I don't want to have to wrestle with penalties. Like all of those things are distracting from what I wanted. So ultimately then what does matter in terms of assessment and evaluation comes down to my offering feedback. And a lot of that happens in the group stations. And then in the Desmos, it's sort of a little bit more one-on-one and tailored. The students do a ton of reflection. I'll talk a little bit about math journals later. And then ultimately, we use a test or something like a test, which I'll call a knowledge check or a skills check, as an instrument, but it doesn't get scored in the traditional way. It just becomes a piece of evidence and a conversation piece. But then the real demonstration of learning is happening through portfolios. And I've just started my first portfolio entries within the last week or two. So students are now completing those. In my next newsletter, I'll be sharing some samples of how that's going, what the questions are, and ways I may need to adjust. And then conferencing. And I'll talk more about the challenge I've got with conferencing in a couple of slides as well. Okay, so for me, the practices of Pillars and Practices is the math practice standards from the Common Core. And I've been thinking a lot about it before COVID hit. And then once COVID hit, we made collectively this decision where we weren't going to cover 40% of our course content. We didn't have time, we weren't meeting as frequently, we didn't even have physical access to students. So the schools that I had been a part of and others I'd heard about were just sort of saying, we're going to cover 60%. But somehow we managed to still give kids A's when they managed to get 90% of the 60% of the standards we were covering, which told me that when push comes to shove, we're not really tied to the entirety of a set of course standards when it comes to determining that students are successful. And it doesn't necessarily take a pandemic for us to realize that we have these issues with how much we can cover and how much students are learning all the time. So I really felt like there's got to be a way that deals with habits of successful mathematical learners and thinkers. And I went to the standards for mathematical practice because they exist and we talk about them and they're generally well regarded, even though I think they're not perfect and there's still issues to talk about and resolve. But my feeling is if I can get my students in a COVID year or any year to become really, really successful at these 8 practices, using my content, my grade level content as the context, then it doesn't really necessarily determine success if a student memorizes a certain skill or even retains it. We know a lot of our students memorize things for the short term, but they don't retain them for the long term. If they're building these habits, I feel like it's going to contribute to the real markers of success. Students will gain in independence where if they have gaps for whatever reason, they can find resources to learn on their own, or they can learn with supports in place. But I feel like this is it. So for me, this became the place of moving away from a fixation on the content standards as the most important thing I value to habits. One of the things I like about it is they transcend coursework. So from students at all grade levels, if they're getting adjusted to this way of thinking early on, then when they're moving from pre-algebra to an algebra to a geometry context, et cetera, we have consistency with what we value and what we underpin as markers of success. And these aren't things you can game. You're either becoming better at persevering in problems, becoming better at reasoning abstractly and attending precision, or you aren't. There's nothing you can sort of game about that. So I thought of it first as a slippery slope. But slippery slope has a negative connotation, so I'm calling it a slip and slide slope because that just sounds like fun. And these kids in the picture look like they're having fun. And it actually has become fun for me. So in the way that my grading practices changed and I got rid of a points-based economy, it turned that I had to change the way I was designing curriculum, the way I was planning instructional tasks, and the way I'm assessing and ultimately evaluating students. So here's an example of a Desmos task that we use in my class, and we'll just take a brief look at a couple of the slides, but I want you to be thinking, oops, as we go through this, where are the math practice standards evident inside of a context-based task? Somehow my link is not going there. Okay, here it is. This is a teacher's version. So if you're familiar with Desmos, then you know how this works. And if you're less familiar, I have resources to share. I've got some activities to share, including this one. So on this particular screen, we've got a sketch where students can interact, and we've got a table, and it's asking them to use the sketch tools to draw step 4. I think I'm going to go for the big dot, and then to fill out the table. So we can see that there's 5 dots and then 4 and 4, 4, 3, 4. And at some point we might understand a representation of how this is working, and they can interact this way. So that's some ideas of looking for regularity in repeated reasoning and also structure. And this one is built in such a way where it's a low entry because they can just count the number of dots, and it gives them an affirmation. And then when they move on, those numbers that they entered carry with them. And now it's asking them to stretch a little bit. I want a sketch for the total number of dots in 27, and I want to complete the table. And so in terms of student interactions, a lot of students just jump straight to filling out a table, and they might see this pattern and they may continue like that. And there's an error, and I get to see in terms of looking at their work, who's committing this error, who's likely to understand what's happening, who's looking more broadly. And the next screen builds it in, that you can see the points that they entered are graphed. And you can see an inconsistency here. And for some, that points out what's happening. And then, of course, a lot of the time I'm talking with them relates to this idea of recognizing that there's a tool here that I'm asking them to use. So we've spent a fair amount of time in my college algebra class looking at these kind of patterns and focusing on what different students see. And this would be one way of using the tools for a student to sort of find a structure here. So now if I wanted to draw step 27, I might recognize, okay, there seems to be this rectangle shape in the middle, and there's a dot on this corner and a dot on that corner. And it looks like the rectangle is changing, but it's consistently 3 high. And then we can get a sense of how the length is changing. Well, in step 1, it's 1, and 2, it's 2, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, students have ways of moving through and doing lots of different tasks. So I'm loving the ability to use Desmos, even in an in-person setting, to have students be modeling what they see, sharing their thinking with me, and that's becoming a big component of it. So there's a lot here, and if we had more time, we could look through it in more detail, but I'll just let you know that I have that slide also in my resources. Okay, here are the pillars, and this honestly has been the biggest part of it. It's the heart and soul. It's the main part that I talk to students about. I came at it this way. If I'm taking away points, which is a system that students know how to navigate, whether they do it earnestly or other ways, but they know how to navigate it so they can plan for their own successful outcomes. And I want to remove the parts of that that I'm uncomfortable with. I need to replace it with something. I don't think this is necessarily math specific either, but that's our context. So I'm giving them these pillars of engagement, understanding, communication, and authenticity. And early on in the course, we talk a lot about what these are. And as the course progresses, I mention them. They're part of their portfolios and a lot of their reflections. And these are things ultimately that I have ideas about, but I need to build these in shared authority with the students. I call them shared understandings for them. So we talked in the second week of school about what engagement looks like, sounds like. We talked about the engagement that I can observe as a teacher when they're working in group stations or when they're typing in Desmos. We talked about the engagement that's happening that I can't observe. Maybe there's a rich conversation happening in one group, but I'm across the room talking to another group, so I'm not seeing it all. We talked about engagement that happens when students are doing things outside of the classroom setting, but all those things are valuable, and we know that those kinds of engagements, whether we think they're valuable in a points system or not, we know that those are the habits that lead to success. So I'm trying to elevate that way of thinking. The understanding pillar seems pretty straightforward, and it's the one that generally addresses the content goals, but deeper than that, part of it is students recognizing their own progress. What are they understanding? What are they not understanding? And setting goals around improving that. Communication has to do with group dynamics, but it also has to do with the way students communicate their thinking to me. And authenticity is that place for students to feel like in a no points system, you don't have to pretend to be at places you aren't. This system is designed to honor students' individual learning journeys. So authentically, you can be like, I feel like I am so far behind everybody else. Here's the things I know. Here's the things I have no idea about. And we can embrace that and build a plan around it. So that's some of the ideas. I feel like there's so much more that goes into these. I wrote a really long document that goes into more detail, and that's also in my resources. But honestly, the document is incomplete because it's just my thoughts and my words. But now that I'm working with students this year, I feel like it's filling out too, as students share more of their understanding from the student perspective, especially with their various identity markers. So getting near wrapping up, when it comes to assessment and evaluation, these are my core guiding principles. I want to build from my beliefs. My beliefs are, number one, the arbitrariness of dates doesn't matter. 2, a student should always be able to demonstrate growth and progress from the start of a term until the very last day of grade reporting. And honestly, I'm open to ideas of incompletes if I feel like it's purposeful. For me, math journals, knowledge checks, and then portfolios are the centerpieces of authentic assessment that is student-driven, and then conversations of evaluation that come from there. And this is my hard one. I'm learning to yield authority. And that's been really easy for me in my college algebra class with college freshmen predominantly. It's been actually really easy for me this year with my stats class, which is 12th and 11th graders. And I'm struggling with this when it comes to my geometry class, because some of these kids, I feel like they're having a hard time adapting, and they're not in a state where they like know how to reflect on these sorts of things. So I'm working on that one, and I'm trying to work out some of the bugs, and I'll continue to share my journey about those things. So I would leave you with this thought, and then there's a couple of screens at the end. One is mine to get those resources if you're interested, and one is for VCTM, for folks who might need a certificate of attendance for your professional development. So if you need those, please hang around. But what will you take away? I know I've sent 1,000 thoughts at you in this brief time, and the conversation is a rich one, a deep one, and a long one. So in terms of wrapping up here, what will you take away? What aspects of your own grading practices are you a little uncomfortable with? Do you always feel like, this doesn't feel perfect, or maybe it's just inconvenient? And I felt like I was ready and comfortable and safe to throw everything out and start over. And not everybody has that privilege, not everybody has that feeling. But if there's something in your practices that just feels like it needs to be thought about, what's that? That's for you to consider and take away. Who are your partners in equity? Who are the partners that are looking out for students first and are willing to have those tough conversations and to look at ways to interrogate our own practices? Collaborate with those people. I feel a little bit here like I'm a little isolated, which is part of the reason I feel like I'm overwhelmed with the amount of work this takes, because I don't have partners. And I'm hoping to find them and build them, because it would be a lot easier if I could think about these things with others, share some of the workload, but that's not my current situation. And then finally, given constraints, whatever you are permitted to do in your school or department or division, what are the things that you could do within your power, within your classroom, to try and improve equitable situations, especially in your grading practices? If you would like resources, I've got the slides for this presentation. I've got a link to the full video with Dr. Celia Ruiz, the Desmos activity of the green dot pattern, as well as a few other Desmos activities, and the math journal that I use with students every week. More about the 4 pillars, and I've got some other articles and videos and things that I can share with you. If you're interested, please take this link. I will type it into the chat for you as well. And it will take you to a form where you'll just enter essentially your name and your email address. But also, if you would like to offer some feedback about this session, you can offer it there. If you have thoughts or questions you'd like me to address, you can also put those there. So hopefully I've got the link right, but that link should take you straight to that survey. And then VCTM has also asked me to share this with you, and I'll type that one in as well. This is theirs for their survey, but also responding to this one will get you a certificate of attendance. So if you need the certificate of attendance, please make sure you do this one. If you're interested in the resources, please make sure you do the other one. All of these links are case sensitive, so hopefully I'm typing them correctly. Our time is just about up. I'm happy to hang around and chat if anybody has questions or thoughts. But I'm sincerely grateful that you carved out some time today. I heard the weather in Virginia is beautiful. The weather here in California is also beautiful today. And I know that it's just a really, really difficult time of year. We're all tired. And so I'm grateful for the time that you spent sharing this space with me. If you have any thoughts or questions, by all means, hang around. Otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And the